well, Schrier, but that's cool. That's
Schrier.
cool. Yeah, not the easiest name to pronounce. So, but when I was a street performer, I was known as Muki. Nobody knew me as Mark Schrier. Everybody knew me as Muki. And I kind of came up more through the hippie world. Like I got into street performing by being, I don't know if you're familiar with the whole Grateful Dead scene. It's a very kind of American hippie scene that doesn't exist for decades. Well, not for a long time, and it probably never really came over to England very much anyway, or to Europe. So I pretty much started out as a spare changing, fire juggling hippie, and worked my way up to um, eventually living way out in the country, kind of growing different kind of herbs, some medicinal, some for other kinds of pleasures. At the time, was very illegal. Now you can actually get a license to grow. But my plants got stolen by the police, is the best way I can put it, after a lot of work. And one of these old hippie friends of mine named Eric approached me and asked me if I wanted to go to Europe and try to street perform. And we'd always talked about it, but we didn't have a show. And he was a very, very heavy guy, and I was very short and skinny. But we were both basically hippies with no theater background, no kind of comedy background, but we could juggle. So we flew into Amsterdam in the '80s when there was really, really good acts. It was when
Why Amsterdam?
it seemed like a cool place to start. we really had no idea. We didn't have a show, but we went to the Leidseplein, which, trust me, I've lived in Amsterdam on and off for years.
Just before we touch on to Amsterdam,
Okay.
Did you ever juggle before?
Yes, absolutely. No, I learned to juggle as a teenager.
Why?
And there's a guy named Michael Bonet that a few old street performers might remember. He hasn't street performed forever, but he was in my high school, and he was a few years older than me. And he was just a friend, and he could juggle, and he needed somebody to juggle with. So we literally took the old shampoo bottles and stuck in wooden dowels, and juggled. And he taught me how to pass and how to, basically do the basic juggling. And then when I started going to these Grateful Dead concerts, I started juggling fire. I started, doing a little bit of acrobats. I learned how to walk on rope, ride a unicycle. It all expanded.
Why would you learn these things at a Grateful Dead concert? I mean, I imagine a music concert. It sounds so old. Those music concerts. I imagine going to a concert as being something where you're transfixed upon the musicians.
No, the Dead was a whole scene. You would go on tour for like 2-3 weeks, and the people that went on tour would all find ways to make money. And for me, I could tour the Dead 2-3 weeks and make enough money to go travel to Mexico or to Hawaii, or that kind of thing.
And how are you making money? Was it illicit trade? Was one of these things? Was the other one?
A little bit, yeah, no, definitely. But it also is where the street performing kind of evolved out of. I had two friends, and like our first street show, our first kind of show, there'd be people hanging out before the show, and we'd literally jump in front of them, and I'd say I'm poor, and my friend would say I'm starving, and we're two poor, starving hippies trying to work our way in the show and put our parents through college, which was ripped off from the American dream in San Francisco, and people would laugh and give us money and give us free tickets, and we would do that before the show for a couple hours, and then after we juggle fire for this is a big psychedelic scene, so there's thousands of people tripping, and two of us would juggle fire and spin fire and do devil sticks, and the other one would bottle, and we'd switch back and forth. What's that?
What year is this?
This is late 70s to mid 80s, kind of era. But it was a hold off of the 1960s in America. Like if you went to that scene, you would still think you were in the 1960s in America. It was very, but it was very cool. Like I loved it. It got me out of suburban New York, and but that's how.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah, I know it was, and like I said, I used it to travel with. Like it was a great scene unto itself.
Were you guys thinking about the craft then, or were you just
God, no.
kids? No,
we were more spare changing. We were just trying to make money. Craft came later.
How did you figure out what to do, though? Because there's some thought that goes into it. You've decided to juggle fire later. You do this thing. You had some lines you guys had developed.
Yeah, part of it was, okay, if you flash back to about 1984, I was living in Hawaii. I was living in Waipio Valley, which is really remote, and I was growing weed, basically. and I was juggling. And next thing I know, these guys come down, and it turned out to be Robert Nelson, the Butterfly Man.
That's right, man. Yeah.
Yeah, and Charlie Brown, who's a classic San Francisco street performer, and this guy Graham, who's a New Zealand guy. Who anyway, the three of them came down, and there was a juggling convention on the other side of the island, and so they invited me to come. And so I just brought a bag of weed. I brought a bunch of what are they called? Lilikoi, which are passion fruit because they grew in the valley. And I just showed up and I traded weed and passion fruit to get in. And so they let me in. And at the time, it was the cream of street performers in America. And so it was great. It was great for me. I had no aspirations to become a street performer, but I loved everybody there, and I really got on with everybody. And there was a lot of kind of improv performing going on. So that was kind of my first introduction to craft, that how to.
So when you're watching these shows, what's the experience for a young you not knowing about shows?
I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I wanted to be that guy. I loved watching, Robert and Charlie, and there was a guy, David Lichtenstein, who was really, really, really good. He was, even going back to Eugene, Oregon, I'd met David Lichtenstein as a juggler. There was the Karamazov brothers. There was Martin and Loon. I don't know. Oh, now this is even crazy. That same time in Hawaii, Guy Le Liberté. Do you know who that is?
I know the name.
Okay, check this out. He used to hire me and Eric, the partner who I started performing with, to juggle fire at kind of hotels in Hawaii. He started Cirque du Soleil. He's the dude.
Where I know the name. Yes.
Yeah, he's the dude behind Cirque du Soleil. But this is before he started Cirque du Soleil. So this was, so the hippie world and the street performing world in America at the time would crisscross a lot. But most of the performers were hippish, but they weren't hippies. Like we literally were hippies coming from the hills when we first started street performing. And it was only because I was broke. Like I literally was living on 80 acres. I'd spent 8 months growing plants, and my plants would have yielded me quite a bit of money. And the last time I went up there were cops there. I used to climb a tree, and I looked down into where the plants were, and there were cops there. So I had to leave. I had to walk away. And we're talking like I had to haul water up hills, like hard work. So I had to walk away from it all.
This wasn't your land. You didn't own this land. This was just land that yeah.
It was neighbors' land. Like I lived on the 80 acres, and the one condition was no growing pot. So the other neighbor had 200 acres, and I scouted it out, and he only used like 10 acres. So where I was, it was perfect. But then his family just came and went for a hike and found my plants. So that was that. Yeah. But that's how I got into street performing. Literally,
so at this point, you've already watched these shows. You've gone to the juggling convention. You've seen these big guys doing these big shows. People who are still to this day legends in the field.
Absolutely.
And you've took that knowledge that you've acquired there, that information, the basics, just by observing.
Yeah.
And then you've gone out broke, post bust, down onto the streets.
Well, yeah. What it was is, again, there's a guy Eric Eric Price. And he said to me, we always talked about, for some reason, let's go to Europe and juggle it. Just see, because that's what the guys we met in Hawaii had done. They all talked about Amsterdam and Copenhagen, and it just sounded exotic. So we thought we would try it. And he kind of said, he was in San Francisco, I was in Sonoma County, and we said, we'll put a show together. But we didn't. And we drove cross country. We both lived around New York. We'll put a show together, but we still didn't. And we got to Europe without a show. But from the Grateful Dead thing, we had a bunch of shtick. Because he's, again, a big fat guy, and I was I shouldn't say large guy, and I was a little skinny guy. So we had kind of a bit of Laurel and Hardy-ish shtick that didn't really work, but we were so like this. You know how it is when you're going on charisma and energy, and just you don't know what you're doing. I think it was Nick Nicholas said that the first 6 months of street performing is like boot camp, or somebody said that, and you have to go through it. And a lot of people are natural comics, or they have theater training. I had zero. I didn't understand timing. I didn't understand comedy. I saw other people do it, but I hadn't made the connection of literally the first 10 shows. I didn't say a word. I played the guitar. I rode a unicycle. I juggled, and Eric was funny. He was doing all the comedy until later I realized it was all stolen material. But he was very, very funny. And then I started to interject, and I'd get laughs. You know how it is. And then all of a sudden I started to improvise a little bit, and that's how it all. If it wasn't for him, I never would have become a street performer.
Can I just draw you back to, you said,
Yeah.
I thought he was really funny until I realised it was all just stolen material.
Mm. I take that back. He was funny, but I thought it was his own material.
So
I
whose material was it?
he had seen a lot of street performers. No, it's stock lines. It was all stock lines.
I understand that, you understand. I'm just trying to get more information about that from you.
Yeah, but I want to say one thing though. I'm going to even go back further. I had an experience during the Grateful Dead years where I went down to South America. I went down to Bolivia, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and I had a plane ticket from Peru back to America, but I ran out of money in Bolivia, and that's the first time I really street performed because I went to markets and I used to juggle fruit and I used to play the panpipes and I would say in Spanish, I have no money. Honestly, I'm trying to get up north so I can go home. And these were dirt poor, like really poor people, and they were the most generous people I'd ever met. Like literally, I would come to a square, I'd start juggling, they'd leave, and then the whole village would come out and watch. And anything I did was funny because they weren't spoiled. They didn't have TV. They didn't, they weren't oversaturated with entertainment. So the fact that I was there was enough. And then afterwards, people would give me food or a ride or a place to stay. Sorry, a lift. I know you're English. Can't say ride.
Right.
No, I live in Ireland, so I'd always say, "Do you want a ride?" And people, so I've learned the difference. But but that was the first time I saw the magic of it. How with nothing but fruit and panpipes and juggling stuff, I was able to make my way 1,000 miles. And it was amazing.
You lived the old life then, the old life of a traveling performer.
Oh, absolutely. No. When I eventually got into street performing hardcore, I was in a van, with a bed in a little cooker, and I was on the road for a long time, and I never had a home pitch for very long, so I was definitely on the road, 90% of the time.
I'm going to draw you back again, just this thing that really interests me, where you said you were working with your double act partner and you thought he was incredibly funny till you realised that they were stock lines.
Yeah.
What are stock lines?
Well, that's if you talk to Robert Nelson, they're all lines that he wrote. Unfortunately, Robert's not here to defend himself anymore, but they're classic street performing lines that work. And whether it's Gazzo, whether it's Robert Nelson, whether it's the American Dream guys in San Francisco, there's a lot of places that the sources come from, and somebody steals it, somebody else steals, and eventually it's overused, and whoever wrote it is just left, not nobody believes they wrote it anymore, so it becomes stock material. But this, and
Yes.
You could do a whole show.
How did you feel when you first realised that these material stock lines? What was the moment like?
Well, you see, the thing is, we had two routines that were totally original. Like we did this whole thing to the Talking Heads Psycho Killer. We had this whole original routine, and then we had this thing where he was trying to climb on my shoulders because again he's big, and eventually I climbed on his shoulders, and it was just kind of sticky slapstick. But it was the lines because I was afraid to talk, and I realized that he was just delivering lines, like he wasn't listening to the audience, he wasn't like being in the moment necessarily. He was just doing what worked. I'm not judging him because it's not easy stepping in front of a crowd for the first time and being funny, and he did it very well, I have to say. But it was later. Have you? Yeah, it was later though when I started to improvise more, that I realized I was better as a solo performer than a duo performer. I don't know if you've ever worked as a duo, but it's a very different dynamic. And there are people like Jean-Michel and McKeel that are just great at it, and they feed off each other. And perhaps if you do it long enough, it's nice to have a partner. But I was always kind of on the road doing my own thing, so I found.
How long were you in a double act for then?
Say it again.
How long were you in a double act for? This is Muki and Fuzzy, right?
Yes. So that's when I met Nick. Yes, I met Nick with Muki and Fuzzy. We did it. Okay, we worked in Amsterdam. We worked in Barcelona, where there was a guy. Do you know an Italian guy named Dino? Did you ever meet him?
No,
Okay,
no.
Dino's another classic act. He was in Barcelona. Then we went to San Francisco, to Key West, and then Key West is where we got a show that actually started to work. But we were up against. And have you ever been to Key West?
I haven't. No, I've never been to the States. Please
Okay,
describe Key West for us a bit. When you first
okay,
arrived at Key West, what was Key West like?
okay. Well, it was intimidating as all fuck, to be honest with you, because you had Nick Nicholas, you had Gazzo, you had this guy Murph, who's a really top notch act. You had Bounce and Ooh La La. You had Will Soto. I don't know if you know these guys, but they're all really established acts. And you basically have people come to watch the sunset on this pier. Now it's changed a lot. This is when it was very free. There was no regulation. There was no nothing. And you would fight to get a pitch. You'd get a pitch, and you'd have to carve
When
out a
you say
crowd.
fight, what do you mean by fight to get a pitch?
Well, some people can be kind of intimidating when you're
Fight
not
club?
very good. No,
Did you put
no.
on boxing gloves?
There was just yeah, I have to throw Nick into the ocean, to get his pitch. No, but no, people were cool, but we weren't very good. We were just starting, so we kind of take the scraps. We take whatever little pitch we could find, and it was toward the end of that time we started to hold a crowd, make money, and kind of get our act together. That we started to get better pitches. You know how it is. But when I came back to Key West, I might be going too fast. I was on my own by this time, and I was doing rope walking, and there was
Well, we
only
can go
two.
on to this. Let's go on to this later because we'll
Okay,
try and keep a bit of chronology to this. So
okay,
you went to Europe and you went to Amsterdam. You're working the double act. The hack lines are working with your partner, and
yeah,
then your partner's Eric, right? At this time,
yeah. It's Fuzzy,
yeah,
Eric or Fuzzy. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, Fuzzy. Let's call him Fuzzy for
yeah.
now because that's kind of the
Okay,
name that will hang. So
yeah.
you and Fuzzy are moving through Europe. So you go from Amsterdam to,
Then we went to southern France to I forgot the name of the town, Montpellier. We went to Montpellier and we performed there.
and
And
why go to Montpellier? Did you have enough of Amsterdam? Was it tiring? Did you not want to be there anymore?
I'll be really honest with you, and Eric didn't like being in Europe that much. He missed America. He wanted to go back, but he wanted to just travel before we went. And I loved it. Like I was sold on it, and I wanted to stay. But we weren't good enough really at that point. But we were
Why
just
did you say you weren't good enough? What do you mean by that?
we weren't making enough money. You know what I mean? Like we were
Okay.
making enough money to get a hotel or to hostel and for food, but we weren't we weren't saving anything. We weren't like we saw everybody else making a lot of money, so we knew the potential was there. But we just at that point, we were
Why do you
six.
think you were making money?
Why do you think what?
Why do you think you weren't, looking back on it now, why do you think you weren't making the hats that the other people were?
Because we weren't very good. Just to be really honest, we literally had come. We didn't have a show. We'd come from this whole hippie world where we could do like 30-second minute shows to all of a sudden trying to do a 25-30 minute show. And again, I will say we had enough natural charisma, charm. We were naive. We were very positive. Like we wouldn't be cynical. We didn't have that edge. We had no edge, but we were very positive. So audiences liked, and we had a good look. So audiences liked us enough to pay us. But it takes time to get a show
And
that.
your look is the hippie look, right? It's the kind of
Oh yeah,
Grateful Dead, kind of washed out, tie-dyed, big draggled kind of look, right?
totally. I had very long hair, long beard, and yeah, and he did too. And that lasted quite a while. You know,
And so you go to, the next place is you go to France, right?
yeah, to Montpellier. We did some shows there, and of course, neither of us spoke French. And we did. The French audiences were great. They were fantastic. We didn't stay long, but it was the first. I've worked in France quite a bit since, and they're fantastic audience. Because of our shapes and because we did a lot of slapstick, they loved that humor. They ate it up, and so again, we actually made decent money there, and there was no competition. Like we were
And
the only act in town.
the slapstick you were doing, how do you develop this stuff? Was it consciously developed? Was it developed in the show?
Both. We somebody taught us how to do this thing where I would lie on my back and then he'd pull me up and I put my foot on his thigh, foot on his shoulder, and stand up. So we had that move down. So we kind of built a little routine around it, and that's where the slapstick came from, was trying to incorporate that move into a routine. And so, he was the whole thing. He was going to stand on my shoulders. And, eventually when I was lying on the ground, he stood on my shoulders, the stupid way. But then he would give me that move and I would end up on top of his. And then we'd juggle up and down. And that was kind of the finale. And, so it was good enough. But again, we had no sense of timing, no sense of, of theatrics, I guess you could say.
But where's the comedy coming from there? Because you've got no timing, you've got no sense of theatrics, but people are enjoying watching it. Where's the show coming from?
It like I said, it's coming from the skill, and I think just the pure naive enthusiasm we had. We loved it. We were so happy. This is everything we wanted to do when we were doing it. So I think we were so inspired by that audience were like, they were enjoying it with us without it being technically that funny, without the timing being tight. They were having fun and we were having fun, and I think that's what worked.
Was there some natural unconscious clowning maybe happening with that because of the joy of it? Because
yes, absolutely. And it, for me, once people started laughing, I started to get, it's addictive, how it is. And so I did start to improvise at that point a bit, a bit more.
What kind of stuff would you do when you're improvising then?
Just play off people, play off people in the audience and talk to them and find out things and steal things, classic street stuff. And definitely I stole a lot of gags. You take somebody's camera and, do all the tricks that used to do. I guess you can't do that anymore. Well, I guess with phones you can, but
not during COVID, but there's definitely still a lot of stealing of handbags and stuff. So you'd see other performers doing these simple physical gags, and then you'd go and you'd look around and you'd look to do these gags, the gags you saw.
Yes.
But you're also looking to play with people, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you begin to play with people? I mean, I know it's a difficult thing to try and describe, and I'm asking you to describe something you did probably 30 years ago, but I think it'd be helpful for people who are watching who might want to go and try this.
I think it's my strength as a performer. It was my strength anyway when in my solo show was talking to people and getting people involved. I was and reading people. So it was early on, and I think when you start performing, you're almost afraid of the crowd. The audience has the expectation that you're going to be good. Now we all know now you're a professional street performer. You can't start your show until the crowd is warmed up, until they're at the same level as if you're walking out on a stage. But when you're first starting, quite often they're not at that level to the end of your show, because you haven't figured out yet how to get the crowd to that level. Because I was intimidated. I was definitely intimidated by the crowd. But once I started to feel comfortable breaking that whole fourth wall and talking to people and being goofy with them, I started to really enjoy it. But we still didn't have the craft, like I was just talking about, of warming the audience up before we started the show.
Were you collecting material as you were doing these things?
Well, in Amsterdam, yes. In Montpellier and down in Barcelona, no, because there was nobody else to really see material.
I don't mean necessarily collecting other people's material, but were you collecting? Were you doing bits and then thinking that worked and then keeping that? Was there an expansion of play and the kind of the knowledge of play?
Absolutely, and that I have to say is really good in a double show, because you're more likely to have those conversations and you're more likely to work on the routines to get them to a certain point. And like I said, it was really a 3-part show, and two of them were very original. The other one, we'd pass around somebody, knock a carrot out of the mouth, and that kind of thing. But the other 2 routines were much more original, and they were brilliant, but they were original.
And so, when you go to Montpellier, you do quite well there. Physical comedy works for you guys, because size, you get this opportunity to play a bit more. You're starting to learn that you can play with a crowd. What happens next then? So, because of Eric, because of Fuzzy, you want to bash through Europe. Do you go to other locations?
The last place we went to was Barcelona, and we worked in Las Ramblas. I don't know if you've ever been there, but at the time, you have.
No, I haven't. It's not a place for circle shows anymore, from what I've been told.
Well, back then, half your circle shows were kind of toothless hookers, so it was that kind of scene, and but they loved us. Like it was really an easy audience, and we had very little Spanish. I could speak a bit, But like I said, there was an Italian guy named Dino who was a circus clown, and he went on to become a pretty successful street performer. I think he
Dino
worked with,
Lampa.
yeah. Do you know
Yeah.
him? Yeah.
Thank you, Jules. Jules Howarth is in the chat, and he
Okay,
put
cool.
Dino Lampa.
Yeah, and Dino helped us a lot because he's a really good physical comedian. So he kind of helped to shape a couple of routines.
Yeah.
So that was,
And how did he help you?
just he'd watch us and he'd kind of give us an idea. If you fall there, it'll be funny. If he was directing us a little bit, and he had very little English. He was an Italian guy. I'm sure his English has gotten much better. And I think, do you know who Henry Camus or Henry in
I should be writing these names down for future reference.
he
Henry
lives
Camus. No, I don't.
he lives in Switzerland, and Dino and Henry work together. He's American though. They worked together for quite a while, but he helped us with a lot of our comedic shtick, and
What do you mean by comedic shtick?
with slapstick. Again, playing the big man, small man stuff, kind of the Laurel and Hardy stuff. He started to help us see what was funny and what wasn't funny and why it was funny.
So the dynamic between you two as physical forms and as characters.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I wouldn't say we learned, but we had a long way to go, at that point, because we're talking about 6 weeks. We're at this point 6 weeks of being street performers.
Crash course.
So, absolutely. And so Eric had we went with after that we went to San Francisco, which was you've never been to America. At the time, there were 3 or 4 places to work on down on the water. There was Pier 39, where all the really good acts worked. There was what was the other one? There's the Anchorage, where all the shit acts. No, a lot of the weaker acts worked. That's where we were. And then at Pier 39, there was a side pitch. But again, we'd sit and watch. Waldo and Woodhead and Dave Rave. Dave and Henrik, and who else was there? The American Dream and Robert Nelson, and just really solid acts. So that was also very educational for us. But we were always stuck on that kind of side pitch, which you could get 80 people, and then in the other pitch you could get like 400 or 500. And
why were you stuck there? What was the mechanisms that kept you there?
Greed. There was only so many shows you could do because it was all scheduled. It was very corporate. It's a private place. Yeah, it was all scheduled. Say it again.
Who scheduled this? The landowners, management?
There was a manager who would schedule it, but there was probably some performer who organized it. I don't remember. The only one who tried to get us on the big pitch was Robert Nelson. He was really good. He was really good. He liked us, and he watched us, and he kind of heckle us. And he was, did you know him at all?
No, I never got to meet him before he passed.
Yeah, okay. He was if I could put the top 10 street shows I've seen, some of his shows at Pier 39 would be in the top 10. He killed. He killed there. And it was very inspiring. I didn't have any aspirations to be a comedian at that point or anything, so I was just in awe. I didn't think it was anything I could ever do. But we had our,
what did he do that was so striking?
Oh, he was just, in full command of the crowd. Later, I wouldn't have been probably as impressed, but it was the beginning of watching somebody just have the audience eating out of their hands and going way over the edge and knowing how to work the edge. And, we were really far from the edge. Like I said, we were kind of very happy-go-lucky, and the edge wasn't there. So we were working.
What do you mean by the edge?
It's a very different energy. The edge is when you're playing with that comic kind of edge of, oh, he didn't just do that, did he? Oh, he's not going to do that. Won't the
risk of offense and conflict? Or
that's one edge. That's definitely one edge. There has to be some edge, but that's the edge that Robert played with. Of he didn't just say that, did he? And it was very funny that he said it. It's the same edge that Gazzo plays with, that a lot of people play with. And eventually, I would as a solo act at times, but on my, with him, with Eric, we were very positive. We had a very positive, happy show, hippie show.
And so when you're positive, you'd be nice to everyone. You talk about how great everything was. What would be the the bulk of the material you guys did? If you're not doing kind of brutal walk by lines, what's your play? How do you play with people and be positive?
Well, we were juggling. We were basically jugglers. So we did, like I said, we did this one routine where we would do the Talking Head song "Psycho Killer," and we get people to play like instruments. We get like 2 or 3 people. I teach them dance moves, and then I'd climb on a unicycle and play the guitar, and then he would juggle fire, and we'd sing "Psycho Jugglers" instead of "Psycho Killer." And so it
And I
was
suppose that gives you an opportunity to be encouraging to your volunteers. You're not cutting them down. You're being
no,
nice to them because it's a positive show.
yes, absolutely. It was a very, very. So it's the kind of show that other performers probably rolled their eyes at, because it didn't have the right edge. But audiences really liked us, and at that point, we were making enough money to actually live off of it, which was incredible. And then at that time, though, I was living in a house with my ex-girlfriend in San Francisco, and it burned down. Like I was living on the third floor of a Victorian house, and I woke up with the house on fire, and it
Wow.
literally was like I had a minute to get out of the fucking place, and I had to go through a room that had a window leading to a roof I could climb out on because my window had like a 3-story drop, and there was fire coming through the floorboards when I was going across, and then right after I got out, there was fire coming through the window. So that also was one of those things of life is today, man. Like
Yeah.
anything you're going to do it now. And that changed me a lot as a performer. Like I just committed myself 100% to the lifestyle at that point, even though I'd already been on the road for a number of years. And all of a sudden I'm finding a way to make a living being on the road, which
And
was,
when you say you were committed, so how were you not committed before?
no, I could have easily gone back to Northern California and started growing weed again, or I actually was working as a medicinal herbalist also before. So harvesting plants, making medicines, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I wasn't too far from that lifestyle at that point. So I could have easily, and we were in San Francisco, so I could have just let it go and gone back to it because I liked performing, but I wasn't necessarily addicted to it as I became a little later.
Yeah.
But the fire was kind of one of those moments in your life, in my life, where you almost die and you think what's important, what's not. If I was on my deathbed, what would I have wanted to have done? And
Yeah.
being a street performer was one of those things. It was a big thing for me.
So how did you, after that, change your life?
I started working solo not that long afterwards and became more in command of my show.
Okay. So when you went solo, a lot of people who talk about being double acts, it kind of
Mm.
feels like a marriage.
Yeah,
You spend a
yeah,
lot of time together.
you do.
Was it a messy divorce?
No, it was a weird thing. Like, we were good friends from like teenage years, so we knew each other a long time, and we had a lot of instances. You do fight a lot, and it is like a bad marriage in certain ways, but at a certain point, I'd gone back to Key West by myself, and my solo act was working much better than my double act, and he had fallen in love at the same time in San Francisco. So we worked a Renaissance fair together in LA that we were on contract for, and that was the last time we'd worked together. But it was amicable because I'd also fallen in love with a German girl, and I was going to Europe, and he didn't want to go to Europe, and he was happy with Martha, who's his wife, who became his wife, and so it was amicable, and we did share a couple years of an adventurous spirit, where we took the love of juggling and the love of kind of performing it in the Grateful Dead world and made it into a show that worked to a certain degree.
Yeah. Well, it was a working show. You made a living from it. That's a show that worked.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So for that, and he's still a good friend. So I unfortunately I live in Ireland. He lives in I guess he's in Oakland outside of San Francisco. So I don't see him very
Any
much.
advice? Any advice for young double acts to keep that kind of love?
Hmm. Um, yeah, walk away at certain points, walk away from each other, and and really appreciate the fact that you have each other, because when you do your own solo show, it's you against the world, which I love, you probably love, and a lot of people do. but you share that with somebody. It's you and somebody else against the world. And double acts that work are brilliant. And I think on the festival circuit, it's a really nice dynamic because you always have somebody. You know, you're not constantly on your own. But yeah, the petty stuff, just let it go, let it go. And it is hard because you're learning, you're in a creative environment. A show doesn't work, you get angry. You know, a show works, you're elated, so you're on kind of an emotional roller coaster. So if you could somehow take yourself out of the emotional roller coaster, I think that would be good advice. I think, you know, after the emotions are gone, then talk about your show. And make sure that if you're counting your hats, you trust each other.
Good advice there. So
Yeah.
what do you do after you kind of decide that we're not going to do this anymore? You do your Renaissance fair. Where do you go next?
I I had a girlfriend. I had this beautiful woman from Bremen, Germany, and so I flew into Amsterdam. She picked me up and drove me out to Bremen. And the only thing I knew about Europe other than Amsterdam, do you know who Dave Rave is?
Yeah, I don't know Dave Rave, but I know of Dave Rave.
Okay, well, he had told me about Copenhagen. He was because he was one of the top acts in San Francisco. He worked with Henrik, the Danish guy, and they had a really good act. And so he always talked about Copenhagen. So that was my plan. I went to Amsterdam. I bought a cheap car. You know, I bought a small four-door car that I could, you know, travel in. Went back to Bremen. I tried working in Germany a couple times. At the time, I had no German. I had no German. And I will say my solo show was working at that point to a certain degree, you know, because I started developing my solo show. So
What
my
I
girlfriend,
suppose we should ask this. What was your solo show at this point?
yeah, see, Nick Nicholas would have been a huge influence. Again, when I met him in Key West when I was with Eric, and I thought he was the coolest guy. He was really young. We were all really young, and I just thought he was the coolest guy, and I thought his show was fantastic, you know. And so he taught me how to do a straitjacket escape. He taught me on an island. We took a boat. There's a guy named Matthew the Manipulator. He probably, do you know him? Matthew
No.
the Manipulator. He he was a he was this technical like guy. He could do seven balls, and but anyway, he had a boat, and he took us out on he took a bunch of street performers out on this boat. We ended up beach like kind of the tide came in, and we ended up like on the sand stuck. And Nick taught me how to do a straitjacket. And he tied me up, and of course I must tied knots like a million knots, so I could never get out of it, you know. And I struggled and I struggled, but I ended up the straitjacket became most of my show at a certain point. Like when I
I was told just very quickly while we're talking
hmm,
about Nick, he told me that he had an accident in Key West.
he did. Oh, that's right. Yeah, he was on a moped, probably drunk, because Key West is a big drinking city, and I think he smashed into a dumpster, if I remember correctly.
Oh,
I think he.
that
Yes.
wasn't the accident I was thinking of. So that was another accident. There was an
Oh,
accident where he was blowing fire, I think.
yes. Oh my God, I forgot about that. Yes, that is true. Eric and me were there, and his face caught on fire, and Eric,
What
literally.
happened? How did it happen?
Do you know what happened? It was I think it was New Year's Eve. I'm pretty sure it was New Year's Eve. Like, sorry, I have to get my synapses remembering. It was a long time ago. I forgot all about that. We were all drunk, and that's right. From the moped accident, he had a bandage on his chin. He had a bandage on his chin, and while he was blowing fire, I think some of the fluid got onto the bandage, and the bandage caught on fire, which then went up his face. And we were first ones there, and we put it out. We put his face out. And, it was horrific though. And the thing is, I remember this. I don't know. Nick probably tell it differently, but I remember thinking because it was late and we were doing group shows and we were like kind of it was almost like a Grateful Dead thing. Like we just kept going and kept making money and kept going and kept making money and drinking and making money and drinking. And I remember thinking, don't do it. Like, you know, I think he was pretty drunk at the time. And I just think, no, we have enough money. Like, it's time to stop. And then that happened. But I had forgotten all about that. I don't know if you still can, but he used to have these little scars. When I saw him years later, he had very, very faint scars from that.
He claimed that you used your herbalism superpower to fix it.
Afterwards, yes, I would have gotten him. I would have made these salves, and then applied it so that way it wouldn't blister and the scars would be much less. So because I still had the hippie knowledge. So yeah.
So yeah, well, thank you for that. That's a very interesting story. Let's jump back over then. So you're in Copenhagen now, yes?
Well, first I went out to Bremen, and I tried street performing there, and it didn't work. Anyway, so then yes, I went up to Copenhagen, and I didn't know this at the time because ended up working in Europe for almost a decade and became really, I knew my way around very well. But this is my first season there, and Copenhagen is typically overrun with too many performers, and when you don't know where to go, you end up in Amsterdam or Copenhagen. But the year before, evidently, it had been so overrun that nobody came back. So I came to Copenhagen, and there's no acts, really. There's this one guy, you can write this guy's name down. There was an American guy named Steve, who was a ventriloquist. He had this rabbit, and he was a legend. He was a legend in Copenhagen. He would do this double act with his, ventriloquist rabbit, and he was so good. I saw people punch the rabbit in the face, like more than one. Yes, and he was nice, and the rabbit was an ass. He would just make fun of Swedish people, and the Danish people would eat it up. But anyway, for me, it was fantastic. It was fantastic because I had most of the city to myself. A few acts came through every now and then, but it was a great summer. It was a great July. I just, for the first time in my life, I was making really good money and having a ball.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think now you're making really good money? Is it the location? Have you changed the work?
At the time, it was more the location. I was getting confident, but later that kind of left, and then it came back because you know how it is. You get to a certain level, you think you're good, and then you realize you still have a lot to learn. And I had mastered, like, my show worked, and then what had happened was
this is a straight jacket show, right?
Okay. When I first started my solo show, I did everything. I rode a unicycle. I juggled fire. I walked on rope and juggled fire. I did all this shit. And this is where I'll tell you a John Feely story. Okay, John Feely. He just looked at me and he was like, "Cut! What the fuck are you doing? You're doing like 50 tricks in a minute. Stop. He's one of those guys again. He has no tolerance for bullshit, and anything that's not on the creative edge of being original, he just thinks is just a waste of time. And so I worked with John, and we ended up coming up with this crazy show where we started the show in our boxers, right? In our boxers, all our clothes were on the slack rope that I had set up, and we had torches lit up, and we were roasting our socks over the fire. And then we'd become aware of the people watching us, and we'd get embarrassed, and we'd just do a slapstick thing about getting dressed. And the very end was he'd get me up on the rope, and I'd walk over to get our shoes. And that was the whole show. Now, we didn't make a penny because it was way too out there. Oh. You okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Please carry on.
That's all right. We didn't make a penny because it was so avant-garde and so out there. But what he taught me was minimalism. Minimalism, how we did a half an hour without really doing a trick. And it blew my mind. And then I remember watching Nick Nicholas with a hat on his foot. He had a hat on his foot, and he had this massive crowd around him while he was talking about kicking it on his head. And next to him was a guy on a freestanding ladder juggling 5 torches with nobody watching him. And so I really started to understand the whole idea of minimalism. And at the time in Europe, they didn't like big tricks. Like in America, it was all like if you weren't juggling fire on a 6-foot unicycle on a rope, like nobody would watch you. In Europe, all of a sudden, it was all these character shows. And they would do 45 minutes, and they'd just do a trick to make money at the end. So that was massively influential on me.
Can you describe the shows in Europe and the shows in America in a little bit more detail?
I mean, I'm generalizing when I say this.
I think what you're describing is something that is there. This idea of, I heard a lot of people talking about when the Americans came over, all the stuff they did was super slick, and I can imagine, at least in my own, bigotry of Americans, that they want to see something huge because they're competitive by nature. You want to see the biggest, best thing. It has to be the biggest, most dangerous thing you could possibly see.
A good example is, Chris Lyman.
Yes.
Okay, I saw him do his act in Amsterdam once. And I mean, there was a 10-minute standing ovation at the end. A 10-minute standing ovation because it was just fucking amazing. I saw the same thing in America, and people walked away, and at the end, they had no idea what they saw. Like, they just didn't
Can you
get
describe
it.
the same thing you saw, just so if people are dusting this interview off in 100 years and they want to
Yeah.
understand what we're talking about?
Well, my memory of it, and again, it's a long time ago. The best, like he did this wacky comedy. He had a great look. He had hair like standing up with these really intense eyes, and he was doing what's it called? It's a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. He was doing the lyrics, but while he was doing it, he looked like he wanted to kill you. And he's singing about what a wonderful world it is, but like inside he's raging, and it was really. And then he was eating chocolate while he was doing this, and slowly stripping until he was completely naked. And then at the very end, he had his willy tucked between his legs, and he had a Roman candle, and he would light the Roman candle out of his ass, and the fireworks would come out of his ass, and I think he must have had a smoke bomb too, and it would go off, and then when it cleared, he was playing violin, like really high level, beautiful violin, and it was a mind trip because his show was so original, so weirdly funny, and the Dutch had the exact. I'm sure the English eat him up too, but the Dutch loved him. They really really loved every nuance of his show. And there are, like, if you're in New York or you're in a sophisticated part of America, it would be the same. But if you're in more of a I guess you could say nowadays a Trump supporting part of America, they'd probably be like, "Why isn't he juggling fire? That ain't funny. That shit ain't funny." I mean, they
Yeah.
just slagged half of America, but
But do you think that's because there's there's a lack of cultural awareness of the kind of the reason why he's doing that? He's not doing it because he's incompetent. He's doing it because it's intentional.
I think again, like if he did that in New York City, it would be like standing ovations. Because it's a very sophisticated city, and I have a good friend, Zero Boy, who's a what would you call him, like a performance artist in New York, and through him I've met like this whole circuit of people in New York City that are just as talented as Chris and do as original, innovative shows. And Los Angeles, the same thing. San Francisco, the same thing. Many other places. It just depends where. But when you're street performing, a lot of times, you're in some festival, and you just, I'm a big person of reading the audience and tailoring my show to the energy of the audience. There's other performers that this is my show, and if you don't like it, fuck you, and I respect that, but that was never me.
I mean,
So
I'll be very interested in a moment to talk about how one does adapt one's show for a different crowd. But just first, just to touch on this dichotomy that you spoke about, where you saw Chris Lynham do this huge show in Europe and then this crashing failure in America. So in America, you had all this high skilled stuff. And at this point in your career, you come to Europe and you see all this character work. And so the character work is people doing stuff that's not skill based. It has content that involves character and understanding of what the subtext is. Am I right in thinking that?
Absolutely, and they're really good performers, and their dynamics with the audience are off the charts. Like you probably know Peter Post, for example. Peter is a great example of that. Or did you know an Israeli performer named Shai? Did you ever hear
No.
him? Shai he would do this whole show. He had this little suitcase, and he would come down and he'd be like, I'm a tourist, and he would do like 45 minutes being a tourist, trying to say hello to the good Dutch people, and he was fucking hilarious. And then I think at the end he might have taken out a roll of bola or something just to make money, but he would do improvise for 40 minutes, and Peter's whole thing was he failed at everything he did, and he failed so miserably, but he was such a good performer that the audience loved him. And at the very end, he'd have a teeter-totter with a stuffed pig, and the stuffed pig would fly through the air. And when he caught it, it was as if he did the most incredible stunt in the entire world, even though it was the most absurd thing. But he was such a good performer that people, that he sold it so well that he got the massive ovation for doing the most ridiculous things, and that was a big influence on me. I thought that was just, I like that much more. Beside the fact that I'm a decent juggler, but I found juggling tiring. Like and trying to do a routine of juggling and talking, I would rather just do the comedy than the juggling at a certain point.
Yeah, and so how did you change then? How did the show change? And what year are we at now, in fact?
Oh
That's
no, it took a while. It took a while before I got there because I went to Edinburgh after Copenhagen, and
So when you're in Copenhagen, just before we move on, I just want to get a sense of timing. What year are we at now?
89.
Okay,
89,
cool. So
say.
is it 89 you go to Edinburgh, or is that 90? Or
No, 89, I go to Edinburgh in 89. And when I say my show got better, it still wasn't very good. Like it wasn't until years later that I feel like I had real good sense of timing and knew the edge that worked for me. And I had a good edge that worked
when you
for
say
me.
the edge, it's like the character and the dynamic of that character, the world around him and the crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, stuff I can never get away with at this age of my life, but worked really well for me in my 20s. And but I went to Edinburgh, and I told you earlier I got there a few days early, and I shared a pitch with Eddie Izzard and with a guy from Scotland named Andy. And
was this what they call then the jungle, the mound?
this is before the festival started. I got there a couple days early, and we had again the festival to ourselves for 3 or 4 days, and we did work in the mound with the big pillars. And Andy's one of those guys that climbs up between them, and but Eddie Izzard, if I'm not mistaken, was doing a handcuff escape on the unicycle, and he was starting to do stand up. And I went to a couple of his shows at little clubs in Edinburgh, and what was interesting about him, like, it was his connections between material, the segues. The segues were very nothing I would have ever thought of. But anyway, Edinburgh.
So just quickly before we move on, was it a similar thing there as it is now, that comedians go there and they desperately flyer through the day to try and get people to go to their one of 100 different, or 500 different comedy shows, and there's 4 or 5 people in a lot of the comedians' venues?
The difference is, even though we thought it was nuts back then, it was probably 200 or 300 shows. Now it's probably like 2,000. So, and interesting enough, I told you I used to work Renaissance fairs. There's this group called the Reduced Shakespeare Company, and they used to street perform it at the Renaissance fair. So I was really good friends with a couple of them. And that year, they were the hit of the Fringe Festival. So you had 3 Americans taking the piss out of Shakespeare, and they killed in Edinburgh. Killed that year. And Eddie, though, would have been you could check in with him, but I would say he was really just starting out then, doing stand-up. Like, it was a very successful street performer, but he was just probably getting his stand-up shit down. Say it again?
What did you think of his street show?
I didn't understand it at the time because I still would have had a bit of an American mentality at that point. I thought he was very funny, but it wasn't as funny as it probably was to me, to my mind at the time. Because it took, I did have that American, more obvious comedy kind of mindset, even though plenty of Americans are subtle, and I don't want to paint every performer, obviously. But it seemed to me like he was more into doing a stand-up than the street at that point. Like, he'd burnt out on the street. Like, and again, I might be putting words in his mouth because he might have said, I don't know, fucking 89 was the best year ever. But that was the impression I got. And I'd met John Feely, and John Feely was good friends with him. So I kind of knew who he was through John a little bit.
What was your Edinburgh like then?
So it was, I can tell you a few stories. Okay, first of all, I didn't have a mic at the time. So I was screaming and screaming and screaming and getting nowhere. It was like my show that had been working in Copenhagen, because I was the only performer in town. All of a sudden, at the end of the day, I had no voice. It was really fun. Yeah. Yes, it was a really fun party. Lots of good stories. Do you know Master Lee, William Lee?
Yeah.
That's when I first met.
I know of him.
Okay, we became really good friends later, but I thought he was the biggest fucking asshole in the world when I met him there, because he was the only one with a mic. He was the only one with a microphone, and he could he kept stealing my crowds, and I couldn't compete with a microphone. Beside the fact he was a much better performer than I was at that point, he had a mic, I didn't. So eventually, I started doing this triple show I don't remember who the other guys were. One guy it was probably Andy between the pillars. Another guy was on a unicycle. It might have been Rex, maybe. And I was
Rex,
on, what's that?
Rex Boyd.
I think, yeah, maybe it was him. It could have been somebody else. And I was on a slack rope. So we would just do pretty much nothing and build up to this big, big, big trick where we're passing fire from a slack rope to the pillars to the unicycle, and we were just making money in a sense. But then one day, so Gazzo comes up to me, and I knew him in Key West, and he's like, "Hey man, we're doing a show at the Fringe Club. We want you to be part of it." And I'm thinking, "You want me to be part of your show?" And I knew immediately something's really fucked up here, because like I wasn't even close to their level at that point. But they were really encouraged me. They all wanted me to do. Nick was there, a whole bunch of guys. So I went, what the fuck, I went. So I go to the Fringe Club, and I'm on stage. I'm doing my straitjacket escape, and I'm doing my shtick, and it's working. The audience is laughing. I'm having a good time. And then right when I get to the point where I'm about to start the escape, on comes Gazzo and Nick and a bunch of other people, and they put a bag over my head, they tie me up, and they carry me off, right? So they carry me off in the middle of my routine and dump me. And so it's then, because I'd hung out with, Nick before and I knew Gazzo, I thought, all right, I have to have a good sense of humor here. Like, I can't get mad. I can't take this seriously. I got to go with it, and so I did. And let me out. And then because I wasn't mad, because I thought it was funny, Gazzo then gives me all these lines. He goes running through the back and say this, and this. So so in between one of their acts, I smashed through the doors and I ran in and I delivered all of his lines, and they all were the audience just went crazy. And then I threw the straitjacket down and ran off. So it turned into a really good experience, and it kind of got me in with the performers that were there because again, I think there's a certain kind of American performer that would have been really angry. How dare you come in the middle of my act and sabotage me? And, but because I thought it was funny and because I also understood I needed to know it was funny, it kind of got me more in with that whole circle of performers that I was just kind of meeting.
You were good natured and they welcomed that. They played with you and you didn't get bitter with them.
Absolutely. And so that was Edinburgh. And I remember on Fringe Sunday, there was a Scottish woman named Aileen. Okay.
Aileen.
No, I think it was Yeah. It was a long time ago. And I shared a flatbed with her. Like, we were on top of a truck. And that was the single most one of the best money days I ever had in my life. So it was really, exhilarating, and it allowed me to go to Australia over the winter, which was
why go Australia over the winter then?
Well, because I worked Copenhagen, I'd worked Edinburgh, and I was starting to feel like I can do this. I can really do this on my own, and so I wanted to keep performing. And obviously in Europe, it gets fucking cold in the winter. So Australia was the next logical place. I didn't want to go back to America. And
is it because it's warm and because it's English speaking? Is that why?
Yeah. Later, I actually can do my show in a bunch of languages now, or as my performing went on. So that became less of a barrier. But at the time, I could sort of do a German show and sort of do a Spanish show, but English was definitely my focus. And I came to Australia, let me tell you this, in 1989.
Before you go, okay. I'm really sorry. Just before you going to Australia, there's something I'm quite interested in that I just thought about. Okay. So it's logically fair to go to Australia because it's warm and English speaking, but was there some kind of hum in the performers about going to Australia? Was there excitement about the place?
Well,
because they just had the Expo 89 that year. They'd had that massive Expo, right?
Yes, this is true. But it was also, it was before it was overrun with street performers. Like, Australia was still pretty raw. Like I'll say we can get to it when you want to go through the chronology.
I'm interested about the knowledge.
I heard
the atmosphere before you'd gone there, the stuff you'd heard about, whether there was a hum, whether people were saying, this is the new frontier, we must go here.
I think it was Pepe. Pepe was talking about Australia, about going, and who else? I think it was Pepe who mostly, because I met him through that night at the Fringe Club, through Nick and all them, and so that was part of wanting to go to Australia, but also I didn't know where to go in the winter, and it was only Key West was the only place I knew, which I loved. Like, I had a great great experience. Because I told you I lived on a houseboat in Key West, and I could row my dinghy up to the pitch, and it was, when I was working solo, it was like the idyllic life. But I wanted adventure. I wanted to keep going. And so I'd made enough money between Copenhagen and Edinburgh to spend like, a couple months in Thailand and then go to Australia. And this is how I'm dating myself here. You know the island Koh Phangan? Did you ever hear Koh
No,
Phangan? Okay, well, Koh Phangan is now, it's very famous for its full moon parties and all that kind of thing. I went to Koh Phangan, and there was a Buddhist monastery on one side of the island and two bungalows to stay in on the other, and that was the whole island. There was nothing there except for beaches and Buddhist monastery. And so when I went there that time, it was like a little paradise kind of thing. When I came back 6 months later, there was like 500 places to stay, and it had come up overnight, and
wow.
all night long raves on the beach. It went from being like quiet nothingness to like this party central in 6 months time or 8 months
I
time.
suppose that's the saying that tourism is the ability for tourism to ruin a beautiful place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then it's like in New York City. Like I lived in the East Village when rents were like 300, $400. And next thing you know, now it's gentrified. So it's true. You find the place, you go there, and because it's off the beaten track. And I mean, I was lucky in the sense I did a lot of traveling in the early '80s in a lot of places that like there's a place in Mexico. Sorry if I'm getting too far off the thing, but like there's a place called Tulum in Mexico, and when I was there, there literally there was no place to stay. You could string up your hammock for like 10, 15 cents a night underneath a roof thing, and there were Mayan ruins on the Caribbean and hippies or travelers from all over the world. I read about it recently. It's like $1,000 a night, new age, like enlighten yourself kind of town now. So I'm really, I'm really glad that I got to a lot of these places when they weren't spoiled, because yes, tourism is taken off. There was a time and age when not everybody traveled, and if you went to some of these places, you only met international travelers. You didn't meet mainstream. You met really interesting, kind of freaky people from all over the world who had all kinds of weird shit going on, and because I was a street performer, I was able to make my living and go wherever I want, which was a great combination, as you know.
Yeah.
But
So am I right in thinking there was no packaged adventures? It was an actual event. You had to forge the adventure yourself.
100%. I mean, even to the point where luckily somebody warned me that if I took my gear with me into Australia, they'd take it away, like I wouldn't be allowed in. So I mailed it to Sydney General Delivery, and came through customs with just myself, and then went to the post office, picked up my gear, like it's that kind of life. Yeah, it was.
That's a perfect way to lead on to Australia, I suppose.
Sure, sure. And Australia again was good for me. I worked in Sydney first, and the acts that were there at the time, there was Dom and Andy. Did you ever run into them? Really, really sound guys. And a guy named Forrest, who's an American guy from Philadelphia, he was pretty intense. And that was pretty much it. There was a guy, Dave Holder. Do you know Dave Holder?
No, I don't.
Oh wow! Because later Dave Holder became a really big act in Europe, and I traveled with him. But I met him in Australia that time. And the places to work were Paddington Market, Circular Quay, and
Where did you go first? You get off the plane, you go to the delivery place, you pick up your gear. Where'd you go?
probably down to the walking street to see if there was any street performers, to find the pitch. Now this is the thing, and this is something I'd love to talk about later. I cracked open a whole bunch of new places later in my career, and I became really good at spotting pitches where nobody else saw a pitch. But back then, I had no fucking clue, so I just went wherever the performers were. And there were, again, obvious places to work, but Circular Quay was where I went, and that was a tourist area, but not a great pitch. But that's where I met Dave, and there was also Bondi Beach, and then you talk to somebody and you find out where the pitches are, that kind of thing.
What was your first show like? How did it differ from the other pitches you've visited?
I don't remember. I remember my first show at Paddington Market, Paddington
Okay.
Market was a real artsy crowd, and they liked me, and my show really worked, and it was very when the energy is really explosive.
And what is your show at this point now? Because
Yeah,
you've gone to kind of England, you've gone to Amsterdam. People have told you to strip out all the tricks.
yeah,
You've seen lots of comedy work. Has it changed?
yeah, it has. I had I started out with cigar boxes, the cigar box juggling,
Yeah.
but it was more crowd gathering at the
Because
time.
the cigar boxes is something I see as an amazingly difficult trick, which the audience never understands how hard it is.
Absolutely. But I mean, I'm not the best juggler in the world, so I just go, ha ha, boom. I just like fool around with them, and I could do one or two impressive tricks at the end. I drop them half the time, but I could do the tricks so they would go, yeah. But it was mostly connecting with the audience, and at that point, I was good at talking to people.
Was it a
And
problem when you dropped?
say it again.
Was it a problem if you dropped?
Of course not. No, 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 no. You make it into part of your shtick, and you use you use it. You use it either there's many ways to use dropping. But I mean, I've never been that slick juggler that wouldn't drop. I dropped like 15 times in my show, and
Well, I started
so
as a contact juggler, so I couldn't drop at the beginning of my career because you drop a contact ball and all the mystery's gone.
oh, absolutely.
As soon as
Well,
that glass ball bounces.
yes, no. I mean, guys like McKeel and yourself who are so technically brilliant, like if they make a mistake, it doesn't ruin, but it alters the performance. Like I'm sure you, McKeel, everybody who's technically fantastic know how to keep it going. But guys like me who are decent jugglers, that's part of the show. You know what I mean? Because you're going to drop. At least I would all the
Yeah, I
time.
mean, I do now. I took the contact juggling out because I wasn't technically brilliant.
Okay,
But
yeah,
this isn't about me.
that's
So,
all right.
so you're doing your cigar boxes.
Yes,
You're playing. This is the show you did in Paddington Mall,
Pantom Market.
Panton Market. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It was my three parts to it, and it stayed like this as I went on. Although eventually my pre-show and crowd gathering got really good, and I wouldn't even go near any props until I had a big audience warmed up. But at this point, I was halfway there. So I would use the cigar boxes to warm up the crowd. I'd hand out torches to people, and eventually they'd throw it to me, and I'd juggle fire for a few minutes. But then most of my show was a straitjacket escape. And straitjacket at the time, not too many people did it. Like I know now, people in the middle of their show they throw it away, and it's like almost like a joke. But at that time, you could hold an audience getting into a straitjacket with the anticipation that you were going to get out of it. So it was such a natural street performing prop. It was fantastic because nobody's going anywhere until you're out of it. And there was so much to play with, getting tied up and, the whole challenge of getting out of it and getting out with, how it goes, like building the tension up. And it's a great finale. I think now if I went to a festival and I did it, people would be like, yeah, what's next? But
No,
it used to be,
it's people still watch it and they still enjoy it and they still
beautiful.
Yeah, it seems to be as captivating as it ever was.
Good.
To my personal dismay, it actually annoys me a little bit because I think, Christ, guys, do you not realise now? It's
How
been around,
easy it is
but everybody does this thing.
I know. It allowed me though to get away from juggling a lot more, and like I said, and watching Nick Nicholas do it over and over again was definitely a huge influence. He was so commanding with it, and he built it up to such a beautiful crescendo that I modeled the energy after what he did, definitely. And I tried, like he used to make a cigarette disappear into the jacket. I tried doing some of the other stuff, but it just wasn't me. I could do them, but it was really the straitjacket made my street show. And usually,
do you think it gave you an opportunity to be you? It just gives you the vehicle to be you.
Totally. Because my age would have been a little bit of playing with the sexual energy a lot, and so the straitjacket was perfect for it. It's absolutely perfect prop. Didn't say anything, and it just it allowed me to not have to do anything but just interact, and that would have been my strong point.
Yeah, cool. So that show goes well. Do you carry on traveling around Australia?
I do. I went to Melbourne. There was the Moomba Festival, which was on the river. I met Lee Ross there. Do you know Lee Ross? Yeah, he's the one who. Yeah, he's the one. Yeah, I knew Lee in New York a little bit. I met him in Melbourne, although he doesn't remember. We eventually became good friends in LA when we were more in the film business. But then I went to the Adelaide Fringe Festival, and that's where I spent a good 10 days as Pepe's drinking mate. And it
Would you
was
like to say who Pepe is? Once again, for people dusting this interview off who might not know him.
Pepe, at the time I saw him in Edinburgh the first time, he was a follow mine, but he was.
Can you describe that just a little bit more for people?
I'll give you an idea of Pepe's edge. Like, there was a guy in a kilt, like an angry old Scot in a kilt, walking by his show, and he dropped something and looked up the guy's skirt, and the guy turned around and, to basically kill Pepe, but he just, he was so good, he just like looked away at the right time, so the guy couldn't attack him, and as soon as he turned around, he was right back under his kilt, and he just played that edge. He went so far into what you shouldn't do in public, and he got away with it because he just had this real what's the word, he's not even more than mischievousness. He was like a character out of a Dickens novel. Yeah, hold on a second. This is my son David.
Hey, David.
This is Matt.
Hello.
Hey, David, how you doing?
Good.
Say hello to everyone watching, David.
What did you say to him?
I asked him to say hello to everyone watching.
Oh, yeah. There's people watching, yes. He's all embarrassed now.
Oh, bless him.
Anyway, are you going to bed? Okay, sleep well. I love you. That's my life now.
Bless him, and he has not even realised that baldness is genetic yet. Such a lovely head of hair.
Well, you know what? Most people in my family are bald, and I had great hair for a long time. I had really long curly hair, but my wife's brother has a full head of hair, and my grandfather on my mother's side had a full head of hair. So there's hope. But the thing is, at my age, I couldn't give a shit if I had hair or not. In my I had years and years with great hair. So it is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. So, where were we? We were talking about the Fringe Festival and Pepe.
Yeah, and that's where I first met Drew Franklin as well. And he was a Texan. He became a really good friend and ended up doing a lot of traveling and performing with him later in life. But Pepe and Drew they did a double show, and I don't know, they all were so good. And it was like a mini Edinburgh festival. It was just a big party, really fun. But then I went to Perth, and I was the only street performer in Perth for like 3 or 4 months. I know. Nobody could believe that, me saying that now. And they'd seen Robert Nelson because he'd been there. They'd seen Waldo because he'd been there, and these are fantastic acts, but they hadn't really seen many performers. So it was one of those things where everything I did was 10 times funnier than it really was, because they weren't used to street performing yet. They had nothing to compare it to. So it was virgin in a sense. And again, it was a gold mine for me. There was 2 pitches. There was a pitch on the Walking Street and a pitch in Fremantle. Have you been there?
No.
Oh yeah,
I've only been through Europe. I'm a very poorly travelled street performer.
Oh, yeah. So I stayed there for like 3, 4, 5 months and just had a ball. It was just my show just kept getting better and better without other performers there. Like, there was nobody to scrutinize me, nobody to feel uncomfortable with watching. So I felt really free. And that is a big thing. Like, when you get to a point where you feel like your show is good, you don't mind if there's a performer watching you because you're not embarrassed. But if you still think your show has a ways to go, it can be embarrassing when really good performers watching you, and you can become very self-conscious.
Is that an obstacle to being creative, to trying new things, or is it just an obstacle to performing in and of itself?
I think to feel free. I think, because I do a lot of, since I'm a street performer, I do a lot of acting, and all kinds of performing. I think you have to be free. You have to feel free in the moment to whatever it is you want to accomplish, to be free to do that and not get in your own way and not have external things psych you out in your head so you can't do what you want to do. And if there's a performer watching you that you think is really good, or even a friend, you could all of a sudden forget that there's an audience in front of you that loves you, but you just pay attention to the one person with a frown on their face. Whereas in Perth, nobody knew me. I was on my own, and I was just free with the audience. And for me, it was fantastic. It was very, my show got much better. it really got much better in Perth, and my timing got better, and my understanding of the real dynamics of making a show explode at the end really worked.
And was this a journey of finding your character as well? If you did if you were free to experiment?
Yes, and the character became it almost. I mean, like I said, close the door for a second. I definitely played, like I said, with a very sexual edge, with the humor and with volunteers, and I guess in today's world I'd be considered sexist. I don't know what it would be. I wouldn't get away with half the stuff, but at the
So
time,
were
it
you
was
flirting with women a lot? Is this what you mean by a
yes,
sexy
absolutely,
edge?
absolutely, absolutely, and it really, it worked fine. Like it was my, like I said, if I did it now, I'd be a dirty old man. But in my 20s, it was just, it was the right edge. And, but also the character, I think, got a little more vaudevillian. Like I got more, like I started to, like my dressing became like a lot of performers kind of suits that were just a little bit out of date, a little bit dirty, a little bit, and I got good with hat tricks. And so I started to be able to do like Nick. I could put a hat on my foot and talk for 15 minutes. And so it started in Perth, really. And that's where I kind of feel like I got a show now that can work.
So what
And
was it like? What was the next place you went to after this?
so first I stopped back into Thailand, and that's where I went back to Koh Phangan, and all of a sudden it was like went from being like a quiet, natural place to like party central, so I stayed there for a while because it was really good fun. I have to say it was really good fun. But then I went back to Europe, and where did I go first? I there was a festival in Kiel in Germany. I remember I worked in Kiel, and my German now was good. Like my show was working in German, and I got the timing down. I figured out how German audiences, what they found funny. I know it's an
What do you
oxymoron,
mean?
but
Doesn't everyone find the same thing funny?
of course not. Of course not. And that's where reading the audience is really important. So I mean, I've worked 30, 40 different cultures, so it's like you're in front of some audiences and they're just staring at you. And for me, if I tried to force and continue what I'm doing, it's just going to get worse. So quite often I would just stop talking and just look around, and then maybe I'd stand next to somebody and copy how they were standing, and, just relax into the audience, and all of a sudden they relax into me, and then I could do my show, but I had to find a way in. And Germans, I mean, the humor was, my experience, they like very silly humor, very easy humor, and they were easy to make laugh, and they had a lot of money. So Germany was a great place to work for me. So I worked a lot in Germany, and
And
that's
this is before the wall fell.
yeah. I was actually in Berlin when that happened because I ended up later living in Berlin, and
But what year is this now? Not when it fell, but when you went back.
1990, summer of 1990.
Okay,
So summer of
and
1990.
cool. So we've got a few years to go until the wall fell, because I'm desperate to ask you about that. But
Yeah. Do you want me to cruise faster through things, or do you want me to take my time?
well, we're at 1 hour 10.
Oh wow.
Time flies with these interviews.
Yeah. Jesus.
We don't have to cruise fast through things. You can do them at your pace by all means.
Okay.
This is your story.
Yeah. That summer though, my biggest, I went back to Copenhagen at a certain point, and there was a guy named Mark, they called him Ugly Mark. He was English, and he was bald, and he probably had one of the, in Germany at least, and in Europe at the time, he probably had one of the strongest shows. And do you know a guy named Vince? I can't remember
I do know.
Vince's.
Yeah,
Well,
I
you
do
know
know
Vince,
Vince.
yeah. So me, Vince, and Mark shared a flat in Copenhagen that summer, and again, Copenhagen was great. Like it was starting to get a little overrun, but my show was good enough then, so it didn't matter. So I could compete with really good acts. I could hold my own against them, and I could do my own. I wasn't self-conscious anymore, and and I knew how to. I knew the dynamics of the street. I knew how to warm up the crowd. I knew I could. Although my crowd gathering techniques got much better when I started exploring new pitches, which is a little bit later, a couple years later, mostly with a guy named Dirty Fred. But but at that summer was just, I just cruised around and had a really good time. Like I made I was making very good hats. I was having a lot of fun. I think that's, you know, a guy named Jeffrey Moshe.
No, I don't know Jeffrey Moshe.
He's a New York. He's a New York act. He's kind of like Woody Allen on the street, you
Oh
know,
wow.
but he looks like he'll hate me for saying all this. He looks a little bit like Eugene Levy, you know, from Schitt's Creek. You know, he's got the big glasses, and he was in Copenhagen that summer, and he also did a straight jacket. So there were two straight jacket acts,
Was
and
there conflict between you two because of that? Did you guys try and separate the acts out so you weren't doing them one after another?
well, he at the time. Now this is Jeffrey and I have a long history. He thought that his comedy was much superior to mine, right? But my hats were always twice the size, or maybe not twice the size, but they were bigger. And in his mind, he couldn't figure out what the difference was, like why the good comedy wasn't make as much money as say the charisma, which if I'm
But when
going
you say
to,
good comedy, do you mean more complex, more nuanced?
that's a matter of opinion, but I only say this because later we ended up sharing pitches in New York City when we were, you know, and we both of our acts worked really well. But I still, my routines would have still been rawer. Like they wouldn't have been like I didn't have the idea like I have to have the craft of comedy. I have to have the perfect comic act that built from one line to the other. I was having fun. I was really having a good time. I was enjoying that myself, and that got me really far. Now people laughed all the time, you know, but other performers probably might not. They might have gone, "Why are they laughing at that?" You know, that kind of thing. But it's because I was.
But this is the thing. I don't think if you have this kind of complex comedy where you have to have read 14 different Greek plays and and Platonic verse and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
it's equally as valid as someone farts. They both create amusement and joy in an audience. I'm just interested in the different. I kind of sensed maybe this snooty dynamic
Oh
from
yeah.
Jeffrey Moshe, uh, which I can understand, but it also interests me that because I know some some of the really interesting comedy stuff as a performer that I've looked at. I think, wow, that's clever.
Yeah.
Tends to not earn as much as
Yes.
stuff that is got a broader appeal.
Absolutely. And I think what it is you have to find your own edge, whatever it is. If it's likability, hold on one second. Okay, give me 1 second. I just have to say goodnight to my daughter.
No problem. No problem. Somebody I hope to have on the show soon, specifically on this thing, is an act that I see like this. A chap called Anthony Living Space. Probably everybody who's watching knows him. If you don't, I'll say a brief description. The chap's about 5'10", 5'11", bald head. He goes out there with a suitcase full of broken toys and bits of rubbish, and he'll put out dolphins and throw dolphins around and smack these dolphins over the top of the box. And it's a comment on SeaWorld and the cruelty of dolphins in SeaWorld, throw them through hoops. I think it's the most clever thing you've ever seen. When I first watched it, I wanted to stop doing shows because I thought this thing was so clever. And the guy always makes about a third of what other people make who do these big power shows. And it just shows that if you're going to create these complex, difficult, subtextual pieces of comedy, you
Yeah.
can't expect everyone to get it.
No, it goes
On that.
it goes back to, like I said, when John Feely really created that show with me, it was so original. It was so nobody was even doing close, but we made no money. You know, and somebody, you know, standing there, you know, take your hands out of your pocket before you clap is going to make twice as much money. And that, you know, and that's, and he knew that because he could do the stock stuff, he could do the shtick, but he didn't want to waste his time. He wanted to find something that he could feel, you know, had a quality to it that was original and worthwhile of putting your energy and effort into, which I understand now. Back then, I would just be like, why don't you just do this and make money, you know, and have fun, you know, that, you know, so it's different stages, different people have different, you know,
Yeah.
dynamics.
Yes, and I think we need both. You can't just have everyone doing these complex, complex pieces. You need people that are going to go out there and create joy because not everyone wants to see those complex pieces.
Yeah, it's true.
So you were there in Copenhagen, I think, when we last touched on you.
Yeah, I can, like, that summer I would have still worked mostly places other people were working. I would have worked. There's a festival in Malmo in Sweden. There was I said in Kiel. There was just obvious places around Europe I would
Did
have
you work
worked.
Covent Garden at all?
Never, never,
Wow.
never, 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 ever, ever. No, the only place I worked in the UK was Edinburgh, and then while I was at the Edinburgh Festival, I worked at a thing called the Street Biz in whatchamacallit, in Glasgow. And then I also worked in Cork in Ireland back in the Jazz Festival in '89. Also, I forgot I'd been there also, but no, I never worked England. Never ever ever worked England.
Was that
And
was that a cognitive choice? Were you doing that on purpose, or?
no, no, Europe was just so good. Like I found a home in Europe, and I loved the community performers. It was a fantastic time to be in Europe. Like there's a real hopefully it's a family, you know. So there was a real good comradeship, and most people were in their own vans traveling around, and I got on with everybody, and the shows were working, and there were so many places to work. It was never ending, you know. It was
So
endless amounts.
was this like community of people in vans just crossing over each other throughout the continent?
Yeah, there would have been places where we all would have found each other, and then like as time went on, like I said, I got really good at knowing secret pitches. You know, so everybody wanted to know me and Fred. So everybody wanted to know where we would go.
Well, do you
But
want to talk about this a little bit? Your opening of new pitches. What made you want to go off the beaten path?
it started. I went to a couple places in Denmark, like these little tiny fishing villages, but they were semi-tourist places, and I just went with my eventual wife, ex-wife, but girlfriend at the time, and we went, and you know, and I thought I'm gonna try to get a crowd here. You know, she looked at me like I was nuts because there'd be just like a few people walking by, but I could see the dynamics of the amount of people. And I spent 20, 25 minutes building a crowd. And next thing you know, there's 400 or 500 people there. And it was a real buzz, you know. And again, I was good at crowd gathering. So I could spend 20 minutes, 25 minutes, however long I needed before I'd get into the show.
Just
And
before we go into this, something maybe we should talk about a little bit, just very briefly. When you say crowd gathering, are you just putting people together and doing jokes? Is this the kind
well,
of thing?
there was my standard way of gathering a crowd. What I would do, like I would start with, I used to have my props in a garbage can or a rubbish can, whatever you said, and it was, you know, on wheels, and it was painted, and I'd attach it to my bike, and so I'd ride up in costume with the garbage can behind me. So immediately something's going on, you know. Immediately something's going on, and this time I'd set up a microphone, but I would put on, this is like before Tom Waits became overplayed, right? He had an album called Rain Dogs, and there were a couple of songs. They're like drunk carnival music, you know. And I would just put Tom Waits on, and I would just set up my pitch and interact with people walking by. You know, the standard, you know, flash them or lay your coat down, but mostly just build the pitch and in my own world. And if I was in the right place, by the time I'd be finished and the music would kind of be, you know, be ending, there'd be a massive amount of people. So all I'd do is set up a rope and walk them in without saying a word. So I would do a good 10, 15 minutes of silent crowd gathering. And it was always kind of a strange transition now all of a sudden to get into the speaking. But in these other places where there was nobody to, you know, if I rode up on my bicycle, nobody would notice me, I'd have a mic and I'd just start talking and improvising and, basically saying, you know, there's five of you now. In a few minutes, we're going to have 300 or 400, so just sit tight. And they'd look at me like I was nuts. And I would build it up to the 300 or 400. So that was more talking. So, you know, again, like the way I said, I would be much more the type to play to the audience. I would also tailor my crowd gathering depending on where I was. You know, I never, like, I did for a year or two the whole thing of standing on a suitcase and yelling "Showtime," but I never really liked it. I never felt like it felt like a fake crowd, because everybody would just rush over, and they weren't my crowd; they were just a crowd. So I found with the kind of drunk Tom Waitsy music and the setting up, I get my crowd, my energy, my vibe. You know, and like if they didn't like that vibe, they wouldn't stay and watch. You know, so that was fine with me. You know, so
Yeah, and so this show goes off. You get 300, 400, 500 people, and you get a taste for this now. So,
yeah.
how do you go about opening new pitches? You travel to a town. Do you look for the flow? What sort of things do you look for when you're now trying to spot new pitches?
I really got into steps. You know, finding steps where people could sit, where you could get a few hundred people sitting. And this started like in New York City. in Central Park, and this is Lee Ross, really, there's this fantastic pitch, and it's probably illegal to work at this point, but you could get like, I don't know, almost 1,000 people. You know what I mean? Like there was in Central Park in Bethesda Fountain, and it's like a theater, and they sit, and they were mostly intelligent New Yorkers with a good sense of humor. So I started looking for those kind of places. But any time I was in any place that potentially had crowds, I would look for a place a little bit away from the main flow. I always found if you could get people to come to you, they'd be much more your audience, than if you put yourself in the middle of a big crowd. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know
So
exactly.
yeah, so that was, and like I said, and then I'd meet. Do you know Dirty Fred? You ever met him?
Yeah, I've met Dave Fred. He was at the South Bank, and I watched him do about 10 shows to about 50 people collectively. He'd cycle through audiences and shows, and he did the funniest stuff I'd ever seen. I loved his show. Brilliant.
Okay. But at that time, he was a powerhouse performer. Like he'd do shows for 500-600 people. Like he was a solid madman, and but he was a good friend, and both of us, like I knew pitches. Like the reason why, because some pitches became overrun. Like I'll give you an example. Like there was Antwerp in Belgium was one of these secret pitches. And I used to go once a year, work 2-3 days, and it was a gold mine. And eventually 2, 3, 4 acts just settled there. So then all of a sudden you go there and the audiences are jaded, and you have to work 10 times harder for the same effect. So that's why I like new pitches also. It's just you're creating a new dynamic in places. You're going to places that people, aren't used to it. And also there's so many festivals. There's city festivals and food festivals and wine festivals. And a lot of them, I'd show up and I'd find a pitch, and a lot of times the festivals would come up and give me money. They come up, like they didn't hire me. Like this is kind of before the big street performing festivals, even though there were big street performing festivals. I didn't work those. I worked some in Canada later, but it was just I like the adventure of finding new places, and you definitely would find duds. I did a little tour through Sweden with Drew Franklin, who I mentioned, and Dave Holder. And we found some really good places, but we also found some real crap places, where just like the dynamic just wasn't right. And that's the risk you take when you go off and try to find new places.
Yeah. And so Berlin Wall, you're there when the Berlin Wall fell.
Yeah, what happened there was I'd heard Berlin was a really cool place. So I used to work the Q Dam. You know the Q Dam?
No.
Okay,
I worked in Kreuzberg when I went there.
Yeah.
It's Angelplatz and
a
few places, Hackschmack.
Were you doing big circle shows then?
Yeah, reasonable circle shows. 40 long shows.
There was no place in Kreuzberg, but when I was in Berlin, it would have been before I would have been real pitch aware. Like what I'm talking about happened a little later. So in Berlin, I just worked in the Q Dam. And the Q Dam is one of those places where, you got junkies. And it's like Light Supply, in Amsterdam, which I lived in Amsterdam for a long time, so I got really good at working it. But you're dealing with freaks, and like you may, somebody might strip in the middle of your show, or a drunk. You're just dealing with all the most fucked up elements. But it's a great place, and you get massive crowds. And because I was good in German, and Berlin is like New York, or it's sophisticated audiences.
Just to move slightly to the side, reframe yourself.
Yeah. Okay, with the wall.
At the moment, I've got kind of this.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect. Yeah, it is all good.
Okay. Moving too much. So, Berlin was one of those pitches just with freaks, a lot of freaks. But what happened was
the wall's still up, right? So
yeah, I was going to get to. I'll get to that. I was living at a squat. I was living in a Polish squat with these punk rock chicks. It was just Berlin was this wild fucking place because it was a free city in the middle of this communist country. So you had the free-thinking Germans, the creative Germans. You had the Eastern Europeans who'd escaped. So it was just this, and the nightlife. I'm sure it was still like that when you were in Kreuzberg. 6 a.m, it's going. 7 a.m, it's going. Like people are not going home. Like it was just one of those full-on cities. But when the wall came down, it was a shocking time. Like I'd made about 3,000 or 4,000 East German marks in my hat, which where it became pretty much worthless. I'll tell you this little East German story. So the wall came down, and it was just like Germans, for the first time in my experience, were the most generous race of people on earth. Like they were like giving the Eastern Europeans money and cigarettes and booze and just like shower. It was just like a really high time, really, really special time. But I went and tried to street perform in what was it called? Oh God, it's a city in Eastern Germany. It's a big city. My mind just blanked out. But anyway,
so this is the wall's come down. You've gone to East. You've gone to East. Well,
yeah. Well, okay. So first, I went into East Germany, East Berlin, with my 4,000 German marks, East German marks, because they were going to become worthless, and I couldn't get rid of them because I wasn't German. And so I went to like the finest restaurant and ordered the finest meal, and it was 8 marks. And I went and I bought like a really good bottle of champagne. It was 4 marks, and I had like thousands. So I ended up giving it away. Like I gave it away to families. I did, people begging. I just gave it all away. But then I
what
went.
was the environment like after the wall came down? What did you see? Family saying hello, or is this before the wall came down?
This is right after. This is probably like about 6 weeks after, because when it came down, it was just the most amazing feeling. Like people were just celebrating, and there was concerts everywhere, and people up all night partying. It was incredible. But then as the weeks went on, I can't think of the fucking name of the city. I went to the city. It's a big German city, and I tried to street perform, and I mean now you're talking thousands of cars. They're all the same car. They're Trabants. Thousands of them. Some might be painted red, some might be blue, but they're all the same car. And you're talking apartment block after apartment block, all the same. All the same. It's just bizarre. So I found a square, and I set my props up, and eventually I got about 100 people, 80 people, not that many, and they wouldn't come close to me. I'd walk to them, and they'd back up. I'd back up. They'd follow me. Like this kind of thing. And eventually I got them close enough to do a show, and nobody laughed. And, it was really crap. But
were they nervous? Were they? Are these people? These people have lived under a kind of reasonably authoritarian state for a long time.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Our dynamics were just too off. You know what I mean? Like they just didn't. My energy was just completely wrong for their energy, is the best way I can put it. But at the end of the show, my German at this point was very good. And I said to him, look, I don't want money. I just did this for fun. I thought it'd be fun to come here and, just share some tricks with you and a little bit of laughter. And I figured, people come up and go, hey, man, thanks for coming, this and that. But most people laughed, but about 10 people stood around me, and they just stared at me. Stared like they were going to fucking kill me, or beat me up, or I didn't know. And I just was going, oh, this is really, really dodgy. So I'm just packing my stuff up. And it was a really strange experience. Usually if you do a street show, somehow you get through to a certain degree, and you touch people, you connect, and somebody's going to come up and go, holy fuck, that was great to see that in my city, or this or that. There was zero. Just zero.
But do you think it's because they didn't know what you were? There was no frame of reference for that, maybe?
I'd say they had probably a big circus scene there. I'd say Eastern Europe probably always has traditional circus. And because I had the juggling, they probably expected me to be more clowny or more proficient at my skills. And because I was just trying to do my German shtick with them that worked in Germany, I think they were like, what the fuck?
But this is what I mean when I say what you were. The context of your character, why someone would do this, what you're doing it for, what is the purpose, who's paying? The state isn't paying for this.
Exactly. Yeah.
This isn't a joint venture between the party and the public, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, I'm really glad I did it. Dresden. Okay, it was in Dresden. And it was even to the point where the city center hadn't been rebuilt from World War II yet.
Well, I was going to say, Dresden's quite famous for the fact they got firebombed.
Yes, and it was still in rubble. And it's since been rebuilt, but it was just a fucking, it was like a Twilight Zone. It was just other Eastern European places afterwards. And I had a gig in Pilsen, which was Czechoslovakia at the time, and it was off the charts fun, and like East Berlin, off the charts fun. But Dresden at that time was just, maybe I got the wrong crowd, maybe it was in the wrong time, maybe a factory had just gotten out. I don't know what it was, but it was just, it was very eerie. And you're probably right. People are probably just shell shocked after decades of living in an authoritarian regime, and all of a sudden here's this dude, trying to make me laugh with really corny humor. Like what's that all?
Well, why are
Yeah.
you here? So after this, when do you feel like you've reached yours? Because you're not a street performer now. You're kind of, I assume, a professional actor now. That's kind of your life.
Yeah.
So I think we will, if it's okay, but you keep it to around 2 hours. We can go a bit over. So
no, that's fine. That's plenty of time. That's plenty of time. Yeah.
So when do you really feel like you reached your zenith in doing street shows?
I'll tell you, I had a really bad experience that kind of changed everything for me. It was I had a really good life as a street performer. Like I felt like I was living my dream. I felt like I was doing exactly what I wanted to do, and I felt like I was the luckiest guy on the planet for a long time. And then I've been traveling back and forth. I used to make enough money, and I'd winter in Brazil, come back to Europe, winter in Brazil. Like I had that kind of lifestyle going on for a while. And then, so anyway, I was in Heidelberg, Germany, and it was October, like late October. And like Nick with the fire blowing, and when he should have stopped, I should have stopped by then. I was burnt out, and I started like almost hating the audiences. And I'd been doing too much too long, and I was fried. And Heidelberg's a really well-to-do city, and I was in the middle of my show, and a drunk came in, as they do, as you know. So my shtick at that point was I had a beer, and I would pour it, I'd put it onto a nice glass, I'd have a little tray, and I'd walk the guy out in the audience. Oh, isn't that great, And I walked him out, and I said in German to him, "Take the beer, but don't you fucking come back. Don't fucking come back." Because again, I was fried. And then I go back to the show. And about 5 minutes later, of course, he comes back because he's a drunk. And any other time in my career, I would have been absolutely fine dealing with it. But I jumped on him and started punching him. And I was punching this drunk. And then I look up at horrified people, like horrified audience. And I was like, I got to stop. I got to stop. Oh, my God. I never, ever, if you told me from the time I was that little hippie guy, who
the
was
nice
like,
guy show,
full of good energy, to pummeling a drunk on a pitch. You know what I mean? Like, that's the journey. And I mean, most of the journey, 99% of it was super positive. But that made me go, wow. I was just hitting my 30s. And I was like,
entitlement maybe that you'd made these good shows, you've been making good money for so long, doing these good quality pieces of work, that you felt like you had an intrinsic right on the street, a public place, to be able to do this show?
No, I think it was burnout. I don't think it was entitlement. I think it was real burnout. You know how it is, like when you're really free, you don't mind the interruptions. You use them and you make your show that much better. But when you're burnt out, all you want to do is get through the show and not have anybody interrupt the flow and make your money. And I think that's a terrible place to be, and that's where I found myself. And because he interrupted that, and I knew when he came in that critical time, my hat wasn't going to be as big. That's what set me off. So I don't know if it was entitlement as much as I was just fried. Done it.
You made your hat smaller by beating the guy up.
No, yeah, I didn't collect money. No, I didn't. Yeah. I was embarrassed. Once it happened, I was embarrassed. I just packed up and left. But then I went to Amsterdam. And I never spent the winter in Europe. I would always go to someplace warm. I spent the winter in Amsterdam, and I had the best winter. And this was, again, a really, really great scene. This is when like John Michel and Peter Post and Drew, we squatted a building. Do you know the Van Vase brothers?
No.
Oh, wow. Okay, really? So we're like a totally different generation. Okay. The Van Vase brothers are from Amsterdam. They're born and raised there. Paul, Jos, and Mark. And they're all classic street performers. They do a show now called Jan Henrik the Stuntman or something like that in Holland. But that winter, for me, was just a really special winter. And me, Drew, Jos, and this guy Max, who's this kind of really creative dude from Holland, the four of us made a theater troupe. and we started doing sketch comedy and creating original 20-minute shows. And all of a sudden I was turned on again. It was fucking brilliant again. So I'd gone from burning out in the street to something completely new, and I really took to the stage.
So you're presenting these on stage now?
Yes, this was total stage, not street at all.
And how do street performers find their way onto a stage?
Well, I think it was wintertime. We all had done the street to death. We all were, we had reliable shows that we knew would work. And I think we just all wanted something different. And this is where Drew, who you said you've heard of or you don't know him, he was a real catalyst. Drew is he's a Texan, and he's a real original, I guess you could say. And he's one that goes back to Pepe, and he was the one who initiated. He took us all together, all the street performers, said, let's do a fucking troupe this winter. Let's make a troupe and put it together. And there was like 15, 20 people. Yeah, we'll do it. But it ended up 4 of us. And we found a squat. We rehearsed in the squat. We ended up doing shows. So Drew had a squatted building called the Itonia. And we had a stage there. And we would do like weird comedy for like punk rockers from squats. We try to offend them. Like, I remember I did this, I had a chicken on strings, and I was doing like slam dancing with a chicken, and like we actually offended punk rockers, which was really, which was really cool. But it was a very, very, very creative time in Amsterdam. It was just one of those, like, the dynamics, everything was original. Like at the Itonia, all street performers and everybody came through. You couldn't do your show. If you did your show, you get booed. You know what I mean? Like, you had to do something original. And most of the stuff sucked, but it was all taking chances. It was all the edge of doing something different.
Like working a renegade stage?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
And how did you guys go about writing?
We improvise. And this is where, again, I didn't have as much experience. This guy, Max Molenaar, who all the Dutch performers would know, and he never was a street performer, but he was really, really good at creating comic sketches. And we were all so different. It's one of those things. We only did it for 3 or 4 months, but then all of a sudden, say it again.
Is this the beginning of you starting to work towards being an actor then?
100%. It was my first experience as an actor, and I also did a play. I did Crime and Punishment with a Russian theater company. And this is, again, not too long after the wall had come down. And these were guys that were groomed from the communist era to be thespians, And, like, it was so weird. Like, if rehearsal was at 4, they'd be there at 2. And they would be doing group exercises for 2 hours before rehearsal even began. So that was my first introduction to actors. And I've never in my life since then met anybody who was so dedicated and who, it was like their whole life. And so that was, and he saw me street perform, the director, and he wanted something comic in Crime and Punishment. So I played Raskolnikov's best friend, and that was how I got into that. And again, I loved it. It was a great experience. And so,
what was the personal experience for you like doing that?
Say that again?
What was your personal experience doing that? Because I assume you'd done nothing like that before.
No, zero. I was never in school plays. I never did anything. No, I loved it. It felt like, instead of the improvisational nature of street performing, I was part of a story, of a living story, and playing my role in it. But because I was a street performer, I could feel the audience, and I knew when something was funny. I knew how to make. I knew my timing, and I could feel if the audience was with me or not.
How what you have weaknesses you have there, though, because you're not, a Stanislavski's trained actor. There must have been weaknesses that you had when you went onto that stage that you had to kind of develop and address.
Absolutely. I eventually moved to New York and studied, and street performers make really bad actors for the most part at first, because you're very big, and you're performing everything, and you're presenting everything, and acting is very internal and very quiet. And they're very different. Like, you're still performing, and there's that dynamic, but one is inside out and one is outside in, almost, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but if you want to elaborate more, please do.
Well, it was I'd say when I performed in Amsterdam, I was much more street performing on stage, and I could get tons of laughs, and that's what they wanted. So I was serving my purpose. It was
You're like a
later in
clown.
not yeah clowning, and taking the lines and saying them in the right way, with the right timing to get a laugh. It was later though in New York when I didn't first started working in film a little bit, and started acting more dramatic roles, that there's a couple of guys I worked with that really helped me a lot to understand inner life, and certain classes I took that understood connecting with your emotions. And so they are very different crafts. They really
And
are. And you
how did
have,
it help you understand? I mean, obviously we could do an entire 2.5 hours about that, I'm sure, but just
yeah.
briefly, how did they help?
How did what help? The street performing or the
No, when you go and study New York and you're learning the craft of acting, I'm interested in how
yeah.
the street performer is helped into being an actor.
Yeah, no, it was it took a while, but really when I saw myself on film the first time, and I could see myself presenting rather than being, and it's a big difference. And I had a good friend Gilbert, who's a Cuban guy, Gilberto in New York, and he really worked with me a bit. He was directing me in a couple of plays and made me do nothing. You know what I mean? Just like really comfortable just being, not feeling like I had to do something, not feeling like I had to, crash into the audience or get a reaction. And that was really liberating. And then not doing anything, all of a sudden I realized you can do it. You're starting from scratch, and you're just listening, and you're just being your part in the story. And if something, but again, you always, and I still to this day, I have the street performer's sixth sense that, especially with live theater, like when something can be funny. It might not be appropriate, so you might not do it, but you still know you could. You know what I mean? And that's the street performer within that never leaves.
Yeah. And so how did you then move from being primarily a street performer to primarily being an actor?
Um, masochism, definitely. Um, I made a good living as a street performer, and like for the first bunch of years, I used to act in New York and go back to Europe in the summer. This is after the winter in Amsterdam, and I loved street performing again because it wasn't the only thing I was doing. So I, New York, Europe, New York, Europe. But then
And did
I
the
moved to
acting change the street performing?
say it again.
Did the acting change the street performing? Did one
A
influence
little,
the
yeah, a
other?
little bit. I'd say my character got stronger, and I wasn't as interested in the stock lines. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to make, but I still, part of it was also to make enough money so I wouldn't have to struggle as an actor. And I street performed in New York at the time too, Washington Square Park, which is how can I put it? It's street performing with weights on. You're in the middle of a fountain with every ethnic mix, and the acts before you, like William Lee, Master Lee, and Joey, and
Charlie
all these
Burnett?
guys. What's that?
Charlie Burnett? Would he be? I suppose he might have been gone by that point then.
He had died, but I knew him a little bit. I
Yeah.
mean, his humor, okay, his humor. He's my height. I'm a little guy, right? He'd walk up to the biggest black guy in the audience, and he'd put his forehead, slam on the guy's head, and go, nigga, 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 nigger. And then he'd strut around the audience, and he'd find a big white guy and go, huh, you try that, you know? And it was like,
In case people don't know, Charlie Burnett is a little black dude.
yes. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Oh, excuse me for using, I'm just using his material.
I had to use that. I wanted to put it in context in case people
Yes.
don't know, because it means
Char-
something completely different.
Yes, that's his material, not mine. Charlie Barnett was so good that they plucked him off the street and they put him onto Miami Vice. There's a movie called DC Cab where he was the star of, but he also unfortunately had a crack habit and an alcoholic, like really serious problems. So by the time I was in New York, he was gone. But there was another guy named Albert Owens who was like Charlie Barnett, older Charlie Barnett, and Albert used to give me these lines to say. He'd like make me do these black lines on the audience, and Albert's black himself, and I'd feel really uncomfortable doing it, but I did them. I did his lines, and the audience just loved it. They ate it up. But after the show, it was really interesting. Black guys would come up to me and they go, "Yo, that shit was off the charts, man. That was fucking brilliant." And then white guys would come up to me and go, "Hey, man, you're funny, but I wouldn't do that black stuff. That's just not cool." And it was really interesting, and I realized then the only reason why I got away with it because Albert knew the thought process of those lines coming through my mouth, you know, and I would never have come up with it on my own. So I owed all those lines I used to him. And like people like, did you ever meet Master Lee, William Lee?
Not yet. No, I hope to.
Okay, they're all like really hardcore. Their edge is really edge. Like New York is a really good place if you want to become a street comic. It's one of like Dave Chappelle used to work in the Fountain. A lot of people would work down there. But anyway, but with acting, when I moved to Los Angeles because that was the place to make money, and that killed street performing for me. It murdered it, and it was the first time in my life I could make a living as a street performer. And I'd worked Venice Beach decades before and killed down there and made good hats. I'd worked the Renaissance fairs. But all of a sudden there's Third Street Promenade, and like there's like three parts to it, and they're all loud musicians. And you kind of walk up and go, "Hey man, do you want to share a pitch?" They're like, "No." Like, okay. How long are you gonna play? Hours. Okay, so I go down to the third part where there's no performers and there's no people, and I do my crowd gathering, and I get a big crowd. And just as I'm getting close to the end of my show, there'd be three bands setting up, playing around me, and I'd be like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, there's people here now." "I know there's people here because I brought them here." So it was like a fight, and my heart wasn't into it at that point. I was probably about 35, 36, and that's when I started to really drift away from street performing. I was making enough as an actor. It's a much tougher field to make a living than as a street performer.
Why?
But more competition, more mainstream. Like the gigs, when you get gigs, especially in America, they pay really well. And I was getting to the point in LA where I was reading for really good roles, like big roles, and I was getting respect from a lot of the casting directors and the producers, and I was, I was knowing what I was doing, and that was right when my wife got pregnant and decided she wanted to come to Ireland and raise children here. So here I am in Ireland raising children.
So translated, you're in films nowadays, no?
Oh yeah,
a lot of high stuff. You've won awards.
Yeah, I'm still in films. I just actually shot 2 this week. I shot there's a TV series, a BBC thing. I just had like a little tiny part on that I'm probably coming back on in October. And then there's this History Channel thing I shot this week. But then there's a big American production in Limerick called Foundation with what's his name, big actor. Anyway, I booked a part in it in April, and I'm supposed to be on it, but then COVID happened, so it's just starting up again. So hopefully, I'm going to shoot that in October or November.
How's COVID? Just to give a sense of timing there. Sorry, finish your point. I do apologize.
I would say Jared Harris was the actor I was thinking of. Okay. Richard Harris's son. That was it.
So how's filming in COVID? We're reaching, I think, the end of the interview now. Just to give a sense of timing, like the time we're in now.
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. So I had to get a test first of all before they let me on the set. Have you had a COVID test?
Not yet, no.
It's really invasive, like really invasive. They take a long thing and they stick it into your throat until you gag. So you go, oh, and then they take the other end of it and they stick it up your nose, but they go where they shouldn't go. Like they go so like into your brain practically, and then yeah, like it's really, really invasive. So anyway, so you do that, then you come to the set and everybody has masks and there's a COVID kind of person there that is paid to make sure everybody's keeping distance. And it's like the last scene I shot on Wednesday, it was just bizarre. Like I'm on a couch. The guy I'm having the scene with is on the couch. He's like 3-4 feet away, and there's about 30 extras, and everybody has masks on, and then so we did all the rehearsal kind of. I took my mask off, he took his. We did our lines, and then all of a sudden we're ready to shoot. So they say last looks, which is the last thing they say before action. Everybody takes off their masks, and action, and then we do the scene. The second cut, masks are back on. And if you get too close to somebody will tell you not to because they don't want to get shut down. So it's very serious. I mean, it's
that interrupt the Actorly method. These masks, does it interrupt the?
Have you ever done any film?
No, never.
Okay. Here's the deal. Like the first film scene I ever did, like on a feature, I was supposed to break down in front of a grave, like, and for my father that I never, whatever. And so I get to the seat. I'm emotionally prepared, right? I'm kneeling in front of the grave, and all of a sudden there's a guy with a microphone lying underneath me, and there's a camera like 10 inches from my head, and there's people laughing all around me. And it was then I realized, holy shit, I have to be in this place, and I have to be so focused and attached to what I need in that scene as an actor that I have to tune out everything. There is no guy with with a microphone underneath me. There is no camera there, and that's the only way you can do it. So I'm trained that way. Like, so therefore the COVID thing didn't affect me at all. If I'd been a beginning actor, maybe, but no, at this point it wouldn't affect me at all.
So maybe it's tough for people starting, but the old hands can get into the zone.
Well, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't get the part. Like, you have to be able to pull it off. Acting is being natural in the most unnatural situations. Film acting, it's just really, it's definitely a craft. Like, if you haven't, some people can get by without studying. I don't know how. I find on film I need the kind of skill set that I've learned more than ever, because you're in so many situations where you have nothing. There might not even be the person you're acting with, might not even be on the other side of the camera, and yet you have to pull it off. So I think skill really comes in film acting more than it does anywhere else.
And that skill you're talking about is the ability to be emotionally engaged with the moment you're in, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques to get you there. It's being very real in an unnatural situation. I studied a lot of the method. Now, most people would think the method is, if I'm going to be a dentist, I'm going to go like live as a dentist. That's not really what the method is. These kind of Pavlovian exercises that put you in touch with different emotions. So like, if you can't get there honestly, like if you're not being affected, if you're not there, you kind of go to your Pavlovian note, and all of a sudden that becomes accessible, and it's amazing, and it works for me at least. But a lot of people, what's that?
I said, how fascinating.
Yeah. A lot of people have different techniques, and there are people who don't study, and they just say my fucking lines, and they can be very successful, But it didn't. If I don't do any work, I find that it's one-dimensional. If I do what I studied, I find it's much more multidimensional, which is much more interesting for me to do and to watch.
Fascinating. So, Mark, we're reaching the end of the interview. So,
Okay.
Is there anything else you want to say to everybody?
Oh my God! Well, anybody who I knew, I mean, it's funny because anybody who's still in the street performing world, like, I've just disappeared. Like I just went to a totally different direction, and since I don't know the '90s, I've barely seen many street performers. I do, but like I said, when there's a big festival in Merrion Square in Dublin, and I'll wander in, like I saw Vince there, I saw Nick Nicholas, and it's like I walk up and there's just this look on their face like, oh my, where the fuck did you come from? Because like they know who I am, but like it's just so long ago. Anybody who's starting street performing, you're very lucky. I think it's a very if you're the right kind of person, and it's probably the best lifestyle you could have if you're that kind of person. It's not for very many people, and I think there's a lot of if you got into it for the money, I think that would be a big mistake. If you get into it for the love of the lifestyle, and if you love the dynamics of the performing and working off an audience, I think there's nothing better. My personal opinion.
Cool. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you. Everyone who's been watching so far, thank you. Mark, there will be friends listening. I'm sure you will get messages after. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Everyone who's been watching, once again, thank you. Thank you for supporting Whine On. Thank you.